continuing with our Bible in 90 Days series. I will not be here tonight for those who are coming together for the sort of debrief, review, discussion, that sort of thing, and we encourage you all to do that. And if you have not been able to make it out, and you can make it out tonight in this warm, sunny weather, we'd love to have you be here. Again, if you're able to read but not able to come on Sunday night, that's perfectly fine. In fact, we encourage as many of you as you can. My wife and I were talking on the ride over this morning about maybe when we get here for the summer, just redoing a read through the Bible for 90 days again, just the two of us. Actually, she said she was going to do it, and I just said, that's a good idea. I'll do that too. So I give her the credit for that one, as with so many other things. But it is, we are almost done with the Old Testament, and I told the group, yeah. Now wait a minute. There's a problem with it. I know what you're saying, though. Now, we were talking about the fact last Sunday night that they're suffering, that y'all are suffering from OTSD, Old Testament stress disorder. Okay? And what I mean by that is the Old Testament is just so bizarre and different in so many ways. And there are parts of it that we have not read ever, perhaps if at least not for a very long time. And so when we get to the New Testament, of course, that's very familiar. Jesus and Peter and James and John and Paul and all the rest, even the bad guys like Judas, we know who they are. The New Testament is about the same length as the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the Old Testament is about 2/3 of the Bible. There are all those names in Proverbs and all that sort of stuff. But the writers of the New Testament, and I'll just make this quick comment, the writers of the New Testament assume that we know the Old Testament. They do. They just take that for granted. In fact, 70% of the book of Revelation, and that's coming too, okay? We'll have BRSD, Book of Revelation stress disorder, coming up. And I'm looking forward to that discussion. But the author of, John, the author of Revelation, assumes that we know the Old Testament like the back of our hand, because 70% of what is in the book of Revelation is an allusion, not a direct quote, but an allusion to the Old Testament. So what you will find, those of you that are reading through the Bible in 90 days, and I hope that all of you are, when you get to the book of Revelation, you will find a whole bunch of passages that just have distant echoes of, yeah, I read that somewhere before. I read that in Zechariah, I read that in Isaiah, I read that in Deuteronomy, I read that in Isaiah, I read that in the Psalms or whatever. There's all sorts of those. So it's really fun, and it's really going to be fun. But I will not be here tonight. Nancy will be here tonight, but you'll be in the capable hands of Terry. Excuse me, Terry. Sorry, that was a legitimate cough. It really was. Really was. You'll be in the capable hands of Terry Gleason, among others, and so I wish I could be here, but I'm speaking at an ordination service this evening. A former student of mine who was ordained he was voted upon last Thursday. He had asked me to be a part of the ordination council, so I went up and did that over in Kent City Baptist. I engaged in that service. That was a lot of fun, and tonight is the ordination service, and he has asked me to bring what we call the charge to the church, which is basically, okay, since you're ordaining this young man to the ministry, and I do say young because he's 29, when you ordain this young man to the ministry, here is what you need to remember. So that's the stuff that I will say tonight to the church that he could never say, but I will, because I'm leaving anyway as soon as I'm done. I'll be out of there by 7 o'clock. But I appreciate your indulgence for me to do that. We're continuing to read in the prophets. Remember, we said that the prophets, while they do predict the future, that is not the only thing they do. In fact, it's not even the major thing that they do. The major thing that they do is encourage God's people to live rightly. And so they go back primarily to the Pentateuch, to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and they point out to the people this is how they are to live. So they look at the first 5 books of Moses primarily, and then they look at the lives of the people in Israel and or Judah, and it's not pretty. It's not pretty at all much of the time. And so the prophets will say, you're supposed to be living like this, but you're living like that. They will speak of the future in terms of this is how God is going to bless you if you obey. This is how God will punish you if you disobey. And then there are other aspects of the future. They just talk about the grand and glorious day of the new heaven, new earth, and all that sort of thing. And so that's what the prophets do. Right? Daniel is an interesting prophet. Daniel can be divided really into two halves. There's the first 6 chapters, which are what we call the court tales. What we mean by that is they're stories that are in or around the king's court. And that's everything from Daniel and his 3 friends being brought over from Judah and being Babylonianized. Okay, I've used that word before, meaning made like Babylonians to some attempt or to some extent. I actually read it in a commentary this week, and I was so proud that I probably came up with it first. But seriously, they were trying to make them live like Babylonians. So they were trying to Babylonianize them. And then you have the story of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and then the gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar puts up, all the way through Daniel 6 with the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And then in chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel, you have a series of visions, which are very interesting, very unique, very bizarre in some ways, very different than what we typically are used to when we read the Bible. So we'll look at those this morning, look at a little bit at that this morning. That's a little bit of the setting, okay? Now, we have to understand where we are. We're living in exile, all right? We have reached a time period in the book of Daniel, in the book of Ezekiel, in the book of Jeremiah, where God's people are not living in Jerusalem. They're not living in Judah. They are living, for the most part, or at least the sort of the more gifted, more talented people, the leaders, okay, are living in Babylon. And that brings some interesting struggles. So and I know you can't see this real well. I can give you the URL for it if that will help you. But the main thing I want you to notice is these 2 bars here. That's it. And if you can see either on your handout or on the screen, it's kind of hard to tell. These are dates right here, right? 1000 BC, 900, 800, 700, 600, so forth, okay? These bars represent the various kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. The kingdom divided in 931 when Rehoboam became king of Judah and said he was going to continue the policies of his predecessor, only even more so. And so 10 of the 12 tribes said, we're out of here. We secede. We're leaving the union. We're going to form our own nation. And so the northern kingdom is ruled over by a guy named Jeroboam I, and then there are multiple other kings as well. In 722, the Assyrians, about a little over 200 years after this, the Assyrians take the northern kingdom of Israel captive. And it never really comes back again. They move the people of Israel around. They intermarry with other peoples and all that sort of stuff. Okay? So the nation of Israel, as we know it here, does not exist and will not exist. Right? There are still people with ancestry and that sort of thing. Now, the nation of Judah lasts quite a bit longer. It is taken captive by the Babylonians in 586 BC, who in the meantime had conquered the Assyrians. The nation of Babylon does reconstitute. It's not on this graphic. Right around 538 BC, many of the Jews are allowed under the Persians, after the Persians conquer Babylon. All right? So you got Assyria up here is the powerhouse. Babylon is the powerhouse here. And down about here, Persia comes along and conquers the, it's sort of like, you know, a professional football or basketball league. Who's the best team this year, you know? And you knock off this team, and then you become the team to beat, and that sort of thing. That's kind of what happens. Now, from here until down here, this time frame here, all the Jews that were living, they did not have a king. Their nation, for all practical purposes, no longer existed. That's what we call the exile, all right? Now, here's some stages of the history of God's people, and if you read through the Old Testament, you'll see these very clearly. First of all, Israel starts off as what we call a theocracy, meaning God is their ruler. Moses is their leader, their human leader. Joshua is their human leader. And then they have a series of judges. And then finally they have Samuel, who is a judge. He's also a prophet, and he's also a priest. He is the only other person in the Bible, other than Jesus, who takes to himself those 3 types of offices. Jesus is prophet, priest, and king. Samuel is prophet, priest, and governor, or political leader. that's where we are. Now, after Samuel, or during Samuel's ministry, of course, he anoints a king. In fact, he anoints a couple of them. Saul, who is ultimately rejected, and then he anoints David to be king. So you have what's called the monarchy, right? So theocracy, God is the ruler. Monarchy is when they have a human king. Give us a king like all the other nations, they say to Samuel. And in Deuteronomy 17, God gives them some very specific instructions as to how to do that. So from about 1040 BC, think of the IRS, okay? I know that's not a pleasant thought, but okay. From about 1040 BC until about 931 BC, we have the monarchy, just over 100 years. Then we have the division of the kingdom in 931. Prior to 931 BC, Israel meant all 12, really 13, tribes of Israel. Because you got 12 tribes with land or territory. Then you have the Levites, who don't have, they have cities, but they don't have a state, okay, like the other tribes do, if you want to call it that. Okay? Then you have the northern kingdom called Israel, not one godly king of the northern kingdom. And so within about 200 years, they go under. They're conquered by Assyria. The southern kingdom of Judah, which is named for the tribe of Judah, and this is where the word Jew comes from Judah, is the other kingdom. So you have these two kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. And sometimes they get along really well. Other times they fight each other. There's actually wars between Israel and Judah, fellow Israelites fighting each other at times in battle. What we're looking at today is what we call the captivity and the exile. How to live in exile. How do we live in exile? This is where the book of Daniel, we find the book of Daniel where the people of God are. We find the same thing in the book of Esther. Esther and her cousin Mordecai are prominent figures in that book. And then in the book of Daniel, of course, Daniel and his three friends are prominent in that book. So this is all about how to live in exile, right? Now, what does living in exile mean? All right, this is one artist's rendition of the Babylonians' destruction of the temple. They destroyed it. They knocked it to the ground. They burned it, whatever parts of it could burn, and so forth. So what did it mean then for the people to live in exile? First of all, it means that the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. They would later rebuild it under Ezra and Nehemiah, and then Joshua and Zerubbabel. But the city was destroyed. Also, the temple was destroyed. The one place that is associated with the people of God in the Old Testament is the temple. All the sacrifices took place there. The high priest, the Day of Atonement, the weekly sacrifices, the daily sacrifices, all the ceremonies, gone because the temple has been destroyed. Think of what the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11 meant to the New York financial district. What happened to the stock market for quite a while, okay? And the fact that no planes flew anywhere from the U.S. in or out for over a week before we could kind of get a handle on this thing. And if you remember, on 9/11, we didn't know was this like waves of attacks? Were there going to be more of them? If so, where were they going to be coming from? And so we became very, very nervous, understandably so. Well, once you're a Jew and you lose your temple, you have, in a sense, got nothing in terms of how you've always lived out your life and your practice. The people of Judah, many of them, the more prominent ones, are taken into exile. They're moved 800 miles across the Fertile Crescent to Babylon. That's where Daniel and his three friends were moved to. God's people now are living in a pagan culture. They're not living in a Jewish culture. They're not living in an Israelite culture. They're not living in a culture with a temple and with priests. Well, priests, but not that kind of priest. Okay? Sacrifices. All of the experience of worshiping and serving God is gone. And they're surrounded by people who speak a different language, who have different religious traditions, different beliefs, different practices. And so the question becomes then, how do you live in that culture? There's no geographical identity. It used to be that ground zero for the people of God was Jerusalem. It was the temple. It was the region of Judah, the city of Jerusalem with its walls. That's all gone. So the question becomes then, how do you live in that kind of scenario? you know what? That's us. We don't have a geographical identity. We happen to gather at this particular address, 1070 Quarter Line Road, but there's all kinds of churches. We're going to be moving up here again in a couple weeks for the summer, and I remember last summer when I go bike riding or walking or even jogging once in a while, I could not believe how many churches there are around here. Just within like a half-mile radius of right here, they're everywhere, okay? They're all over the place. I haven't visited a couple. But it was just amazing. There's no one geographical place. We also live in a culture that is America. And other Christians live in Canada or Mexico or Brazil or the Middle East or China or Australia. So God's people do not have a geographical identity. They are exiled all over the world. They're dispersed all over the world. That's kind of the way it's supposed to be. As a result of that, we live in a variety of non-believing cultures. And some of those cultures are relatively sympathetic to the gospel. They don't necessarily endorse it, but, whatever. Live and let live. But you have others that are very hostile. And we have seen in our country here in recent years a growing hostility toward the gospel. It's there and it will continue to be there. Whether we have a reprieve right now or not, I don't know. It remains to be seen. But that's kind of who we are. All right, so what is it like for us to live in exile? Because in a very real sense, we do. Well, Daniel and his 3 friends did. They lived in exile. First, here's what the plan was. The plan was to make Daniel and his 3 friends, and by the way, their names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But those are their Babylonian names. They were given new names. By the way, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are all names that involve the name of a Babylonian god. Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Okay? The nego in Abednego is like Nebuchadnezzar. Right? Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. You don't hear that very often. For some reason, the author of Daniel chose, perhaps so we didn't get him confused, he chose to refer to Daniel by his Hebrew name. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are different forms of names that incorporate the name of God. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So whatever reason, it's not necessarily, Daniel's the more prominent character, but there's no doubt that his 3 friends are strongly observing and worshiping the Lord. No doubt about that at all. Okay? So the first plan is to make them Babylonian, to Babylonianize them. That's what Nebuchadnezzar tries to do. He tries to pick the best and the brightest and from the nation of Judah and have them become Babylonian. What he's trying to do is he's trying to wipe out Jewish culture, Jewish religion, Jewish faith, but he's trying to do it by absorption. He's trying to do it by, when folks come into assimilation is maybe a good word. He's trying to get them to become Babylonian. It's interesting how they react to that. I'll say more about that in just a minute. In many respects, this is what our culture, our society wants to do with us. Right? Nebuchadnezzar wants to have Daniel and his 3 friends think like Babylonians, become Babylonians, eat like Babylonians, drink like Babylonians, observe, live, just become Babylonian. Right? That's kind of what our culture wants us to do with us. Wants to do with us in many respects. Not always, not everywhere, not all the time, but there are times when our culture wants to move us away from our faith and our convictions. So the question for us becomes, how can I live in this culture and still be a part of this culture? Because we are, right? We have a special service every year for the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is one of the biggest, most profound cultural icons that we have. And so we embrace that, and that's okay. We can do that. There's all kinds of ways that we embrace the culture around us, right? So the training begins in chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Now, some aspects of life in Babylon were permissible, just like some aspects of the culture that we live in Muskegon or in West Michigan are certainly permissible for us. For example, and most commentators, I read through a few more commentators this week, most commentators don't really pick up on this very much. And it always strikes me as a bit unusual. But in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 4, here's what we see. Go back to verse 3, Daniel 1:3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them, verse 4, the language and the literature of the Babylonians. That's okay. There's not a problem with that. To learn how to speak Babylonian, okay? It's an early form of Aramaic, and to also learn Babylonian literature. We learn literature. Okay? Our friend Tom is a Second World War scholar, and he loves to read anything on, that's why Battle of Midway, right? That's why. Okay. And so whenever I have a question, which is not too often, but whenever I have a question about American history, that's where I go to. Tom's my, or at least certainly would be my source of default. So reading books, engaging in the arts, okay? Observing the arts, going to see a good film at the movie theater, reading a good book, listening to a song. Remember I talked the other week, I was thinking about this the other day, John Legend's song, all your curves and all your edges, all your perfect imperfections, all of me loves all of you. We can actually learn some things from the culture, some very good and helpful things. Now, do we just simply open the floodgates and just let everything come in? No. No, we don't do that, okay? So look at chapter 1, verse 8, okay? The idea was for these guys to go on a Babylonian diet. But Daniel in verse 8 says, resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now again, we read that God had caused in verse 9, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But basically, there were certain things that as followers of the Lord, that Daniel and his three friends could do. Learn Babylonian language. Learn Babylonian literature. And there are certain aspects of our culture that we can be involved in. Right? We can watch the Tigers. That's okay. Although after last night, I'm not so sure. Okay? If you don't know, yeah. Bottom of the ninth, okay? The closer, Francisco Rodriguez, who I refer to as the opener, okay? Opened the door for a 2-run rally and the Tigers lost. I'm sorry if I just ruined your whole Sunday morning, okay? But we do, don't we? We get involved in all sorts of things in the culture, and that's okay. But anytime something in the culture is contrary to the teaching of Scripture, then we have to say no. We don't simply build walls between us and the culture, and we don't simply build bridges either. We build bridges, but we have very careful guardians of those bridges. What will we let in? What will we not let in? So what we have to do is constantly, and the book of Daniel teaches us this, okay, that we must realize that as God's people, we are called upon to live in, engage with, and even be a part of the culture in which we find ourselves. We can say as Christians, as followers of Jesus, just like anybody else, watch us go. Okay? We can say that. Right? You know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about, right? You're Muskegonites, right? I see the billboard on the way home, Muskegon, promoting Muskegon, right? All the ways to promote it. Yeah, we can do that. We can absolutely do that. We can work very hard along with others to promote our community here in Muskegon. But while we build bridges and not walls around us, we must always be sure not to violate God's laws. So we don't just let anybody in or anything in that respect. It's very important for us to understand that God has his standards. I grew up in a church that the tradition was probably primarily, mostly, strongly, how do we react to the culture? We build walls. Okay? When I went to Cornerstone University 40 years ago, the one of our presidents who came along later, he said, you struck me when I came here as the little school on the East Beltline, a little Christian college on the East Beltline that just wanted to be left alone. Okay? I don't want us to be the little church on the corner of Coeur d'Alene and Apple Avenue just wants to be left alone. I want us to engage this community. I want us to get to know, I want people to know that we're here, okay? And then I want us to engage with them and have relationships with them, but only in ways that honor and glorify God. And that's the challenge that we have before us. Second, We have to realize that serving God and not the culture could cost us a lot. Maybe even, in some respects, our very lives. If you look at Daniel chapter 3 and verse 16, beginning at verse 16, this was the passage that was read this morning by Tom. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of God that you have set up. Now, it's one thing for us to say, you know, you can do whatever you want to us, but our God is going to protect us. He's not going to let bad things happen to us. It's quite another thing to say, you know, even if you are successful in carrying out your threats against us, please understand that we will never worship anything or anyone except the God of heaven. That's an important distinction. Okay? And we see that in Daniel chapter 3. I don't like this idea. You know, I'm not comfortable with it, obviously. None of us is. Okay? What they say is that God can deliver them. Oh, you got this fiery furnace? You got it heated up 7 times hotter than it's been heated before? That's okay. Our God is more powerful than your flimsy little furnace. And so we know that he can deliver us from that. But even if he doesn't, we will never worship your gods or your image that you've built up. May we be so determined. It's easy to participate in the culture when the culture is not at odds with what we believe. And quite frankly, it's easy to handle the threats of the culture if we think that going into it that God's going to protect us. He's not going to let anything bad happen to us. But if we know that things will happen to us, physical harm, being marginalized, being slandered, right? This interesting topic, how have Christians been slandered throughout the history of the church? There are all sorts of ways. Okay? So even if the world threatens to do things to us, if we don't go along with their agenda, we know that God can deliver us from the world's threats. But even if he doesn't, we will never compromise the teaching of the Word of God. Third, we can be assured that no matter how great the forces of this world may seem, God will always, is and it will always be greater than any of them. Daniel is told in Daniel chapter 4, well, let's take a look at it. Daniel chapter 4, verses 34 to 37. At the end of time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, this is, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar, did you know Nebuchadnezzar wrote part of the Bible? Did you know that? Did you know Nebuchadnezzar gives his personal testimony in Daniel chapter 4? And that you may very well get to heaven and say, who are you? You know, and ask, I'm Paul, I'm Peter, I'm John, I'm, you know, Isaiah, I'm Moses. Oh, well, who are you? I'm Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar? What are you doing here? I thought you were a bad guy. Oh, you obviously didn't read Daniel chapter 4 and you read through the Bible in 90 days, did you? So you see what he says here, okay? Daniel 34. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking, okay? Daniel 4, verses 34 to 37. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. My sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? That's Nebuchadnezzar saying this. Our faith is in God and not in political parties or leaders. We may or may not be comfortable with one particular political candidate or one particular political party, and those are conversations that I would love to have with you. Okay? But I'm here not to serve as the head of a political action committee. I'm here to serve as the pastor of a church. And you and I are called to be the people of God living in the world. And we're going to have those disagreements. We're going to have those conversations. But we need to know that our faith is ultimately in a God and not in a political system. Fourthly, and last of all, Daniel models for us what it means to be devoted to God and to prayer. all I want to do with this, and I'll do this really quickly because our time has gone by too quickly. Daniel chapter 6, let me just read the first 12 verses, and I want to make one final point. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him. He was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, they said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Okay? That's quite a compliment they actually paid to him. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. You're very familiar with this story. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the window opened toward Jerusalem, and he said, "Well, I used to pray here every day, but I can't do it now." Is that what it says? No. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. The 6 words of that passage I want you to notice, just as he had done before. Daniel prays to God 3 times a day, not simply to violate God's law, or not to violate God's law, whatever, but because this was what he had always done. It wasn't like, well, you can't pray to your God, and they says, "Oh, I'm being threatened if I pray. I guess I better pray." He prayed all the time. But he was not going to allow the king of Persia, in this case. Daniel's an old man by now. Daniel's probably in his 70s or 80s, maybe older than that. An older man, okay? Got to watch what I say here, because I'm indicting myself as well, okay? But he is an older man. He's not the young, strong, handsome, brilliant, maybe brilliant, but he's not this young, strong man he is in chapter 1. He's up there in years. And he knows that physically he can't endure much abuse. But he's going to pray because that's what he has always done. This was nothing new. How much of my praying is seasonal? How much of my praying is when I'm in trouble, I pray? Things are going well, great, I don't need to pray. But all of a sudden, things start to look bad. Ooh, better pray, in case of emergency, break glass kind of approach to our prayer life. That's not what Daniel did. Daniel's life custom was to pray. How do we live in exile? We make sure that we build bridges, but not walls, between us and the culture. But we also make sure that we're very careful in building those bridges. We engage. Remember, Jesus told us that we were in the world, but not of the world, but that we were to go into the world. That's what we're called to do. Daniel models for us what it means to do that. So the book is, and it's valuable for a lot of other reasons as well. Daniel is to the Old Testament what the book of Revelation is to the New Testament, Daniel 7 through 12. We'll talk more about that later. But that's what we're called to do. We are called to engage the world, not simply to segregate ourselves from it, but to engage it with the light and let the light of the gospel drive out the darkness. And that's what Daniel enables us and shows us how to do. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for what you blessed us with.